Hi, this is Dr. Barry Singer. I'm the director of the MS Center for Innovations in Care at Missouri Baptist Medical Center. Thanks so much for downloading this MS Living Well podcast. Thanks to Santa Fe Genzyme for sponsoring this special episode on clinical trials. We've seen some amazing advancements in MS care in the last 25 years, and much of that work could never have been done without clinical trials. There's a strong history of the MS community coming together to participate in these studies to help find new treatments for themselves and generations to come. I've been an investigator in more than 35 multiple sclerosis clinical trials focused on new treatments over the past 25 years. I can say firsthand that some experimental medications have improved the disease course of my patients. Many of my MS patients have participated in clinical trials that have led to FDA approval of medications that are now available to the wider MS community. But during the pandemic, many trials are struggling to find participants. In this episode, we'll learn how clinical trials work and how we monitor safety. We'll also explore some exciting research that's going on in the MS world. We'll be joined by two experts, Dr. Robert Bermel and Dr. Jiwan Oh. Dr. Bermel is a neurologist at the Mellon Center for Multiple Sclerosis at the Cleveland Clinic. He'll tell us about several active clinical trials looking at new treatment strategies and medications for people living with MS. But first, we'll talk to Dr. Jiwan Oh about how clinical trials work. Dr. Oh is director of the Barlow MS Center, a world leader in MS research and education at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. She's also an associate professor of neurology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Oh did her college work at the University of Toronto, got an MD from Queen's University, and did a neurology residency at University of Toronto. She then went on to Johns Hopkins University, where she got a PhD in clinical investigations in public health and did a neuroimmunology fellowship. Dr. Oh's research focuses on advanced imaging techniques for the brain and the spinal cord in a clinical setting. She's also the lead investigator in a national Canadian study looking at disease progression in people living with multiple sclerosis. So welcome, Dr. Oh, to the podcast.
Thanks, Barry, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jiwan, a lot of people out there living with MS hear about clinical trials, but there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of unknowns. So, what are clinical trials and why are they really important?
So there's many different agents that are always being tested to see if there is a beneficial effect in people living with MS. And, for a drug to actually make it into the clinical trial setting, there has to be a lot of basic science research first, and then these experimental agents are often tested in animals, and then they go into clinical trials for human beings for a particular disease state. And so essentially, a clinical trial is a setting where an agent that possibly may have a benefit in people with MS is tested in a pretty rigorous way to see if there is the benefit from a clinical standpoint that we hope that there will be.
Yeah, that's great. What do the clinical trials in MS investigate?
There's many different kinds of clinical trials, and sometimes it's looking for whether there is a beneficial clinical effect. We want to make sure it's safe. And then there are, trials that can look at other aspects of different drugs, including whether there's a beneficial effect in addition to an already existing agent, and the list goes on. So it really depends on what the objective of the clinical trial is, but most clinical trials do focus on whether there is a beneficial clinical effect in a specific disease state like MS.
Right. And it's interesting, though, sometimes we also have clinical trials looking at other interventions, right? So like cognitive behavioral therapy or exercise to see if it has an impact on some of the symptoms of MS.
Absolutely. And this is actually becoming much more common in the MS field as well. There's many international studies looking at exercise and wellness and mindfulness and all of these different therapies that, in addition to some of the pharmaceutical agents that we use, likely will show some benefit in people living with MS.
Right, even diet with MS. So I think we need a little more funding for that.
Absolutely. And these are all trials that are always a little bit more difficult to do just because they require really large sample sizes and lots of visits for patients. But I think actually in the trial field, an area where we should be focusing a lot more of our efforts in the years to come.
So how does medication go through the different phases of clinical trials in order to get approved. What are these stages that leads from the animal research to regulatory approval?
Every geographic area has a regulatory body like the FDA that essentially oversees whether a drug finally makes it to the stage where it's approved widely for people with a certain disease. And obviously, right now we're talking about MS. In Canada, the equivalent is Health Canada, and in Europe, the equivalent is the European Medicines Agency. And the process is pretty similar, despite the fact that we live in very different areas. So it's pretty complicated, actually, for an experimental agent to make it to the point where we can prescribe it readily. First, it requires a lot of lab-based research studies showing that it potentially may have a beneficial effect. Then it's often tested in animals. Then it starts in human clinical trials, and there's many phases of development of different drugs. And it goes from a phase 1 study that typically looks at the pharmacodynamics and kinetics of a drug. And that just means when a human being takes a drug, how it's broken down in the body. If it meets all of the requirements of a phase 1 clinical trial and that it likely is safe to be used in humans. Then it goes into phase 2 clinical trials, which is typically referred to as a proof of concept clinical trial. And this is where you're testing it in people with MS. And you want to see that it likely has the effect that you think it does, but usually you don't use clinical outcomes as the outcome measure. In the MS world, because we use MRIs so frequently in phase 2 clinical trials in MS, very frequently the endpoint that we look at is MRI measures that we know are highly relevant to clinical outcome measures.
So we want to say that that medication reduces new active lesions, such as with contrast that we give through the vein.
Exactly. The most common outcome measure that is used in phase 2 clinical trials of relapsing MS patients, it's gadolinium enhancing lesions. And then if it meets that endpoint, then it goes into very large phase 3 clinical trial settings, which is when you're looking in a large group of MS patients with specific inclusion and exclusion criteria, whether that agent has the beneficial clinical effect that we're hoping it will. And then obviously included in there are MRI effects and various other measures as well.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So who's a candidate for an MS clinical trial?
Well, it actually depends on the specific clinical trial. And there's something called inclusion and exclusion criteria. That's a list of criteria that patients either need to meet or cannot have in order to participate in the clinical trial. However, for most relapsing MS clinical trials, for instance, the inclusion and exclusion criteria are pretty similar. There's a certain age range you need to be in. Often there's cutoffs for disability levels, and there's certain exclusion criteria that are often specific to the experimental agent itself. For instance, if we know that an experimental agent may have effects on certain other systems in the body, patients who happen to have comorbidities in these other systems may be excluded from the clinical trial. So all of these essentially are related to being able to, in the best possible way, measure both clinical efficacy, but also ensure that people who enroll in the clinical trial are safe.
Right. And sometimes the inclusion criteria may be 5 or 8 different things. It may say 18 to 55 years of age and certain criteria. The exclusion criteria sometimes get lengthy. I see a lot of our clinical trials have 35 different things that if you have, you may be out. So sometimes I think that's a little frustrating.
Absolutely. And it can get pretty complicated. But then if you think about it, after the drug is approved, it's often used in a much wider population of people that don't necessarily meet all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria in the initial clinical trial. So this is something you need to be wary of even after an agent is approved, say by the FDA, because when we use it in the real world, it's used in a much wider range of patients than has been tested in clinical trial settings.
Right. It is important that once the drug gets approved, we keep examining and following people in different other clinical trials, including phase 4, and monitoring people how they do once it gets approved.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important step because, you and I know that in the MS world, with all of these new drugs being approved, there have been safety signals that have emerged only when the drug started to be widely used in the real world.
We also want diverse populations in our clinical trials too. Some of our clinical trials are primarily recruited from Eastern Europe. So we want to make sure that we got racial, ethnic diversity so we understand how the medications perform in different people.
Absolutely.
Many of our clinical trials are randomized. So what does randomization mean?
Essentially, when you have a group of patients who are willing to participate in a trial, there's always treatment arms within the clinical trial. And it's essentially assigning patients to each treatment arm in a completely random way. And the reason this is important is because, from a scientific standpoint, we think that if treatment arms are assigned in a random way, there won't be any sort of bias in terms of which patients are enrolled in which treatment arm. And so, for instance, in many phase 3 clinical trials, there's the experimental agent and the placebo arm. If patients were not randomized, it may be that study investigators may preferentially enroll patients with certain disease characteristics into one treatment arm versus another. And obviously, this would completely skew the results that you see at the end. So we're just trying to safeguard and prevent that aspect at the beginning of the clinical trial.
Great. So let's go on to a concept called informed consent. What does that really mean?
It's probably one of the most important steps in enrolling an individual in a clinical trial. I would actually say it probably is the most important step. And this refers to the process of ensuring that someone who is enrolling in a clinical trial completely understands what the trial is about, what the trial is trying to test, and potential risks they have by enrolling in the trial. And so once this is done, patients will either provide informed consent or decline participating in the study. And they're also given quite a bit of information to read over and maybe even take home with them before they decide. So this essentially refers to the process of ensuring that the patient has all the information necessary and then consents to participating in the study once they have had the time to be able to look over this information and absorb it.
Yeah, sometimes those consent forms can be quite long, 16 pages, but they are written in plain language so that people can really understand what they're signing up for.
Yes.
So if you enter a trial, I think this question comes up a lot. How do I know if I'm going to get a placebo or I'm going to get the active drug?
This depends on the design of the clinical trial, but in almost all cases, when a placebo is used, which is an agent that is administered that doesn't have any active pharmaceutical properties, and this is done in many phase 3 clinical trials because you're trying to set up an experimental setting where there is very little bias. And in order to do that, people cannot be made aware of what arm of the study they're enrolled in. And so in a placebo-controlled clinical trial, it's often blinded. And what that means is the patient is unaware of whether they are getting the experimental drug or the placebo. And even the examining physician, as well as the trialist, is unaware of whether patients are on an active drug or placebo. This is what is referred to as a double-blinded or sometimes triple-blinded clinical trial, and it's thought to be the most scientifically rigorous way to assess if a drug has an effect. Because sometimes when people know what arm of a trial you're in, it may influence what you think about how, say, a patient is doing, or for the patient, it may influence how they think they are doing. This is a very, very common design, particularly in phase 3 clinical trials, and kind of scientifically accepted as the best way to study the effect of a drug. But obviously, it requires that people are unaware of what treatment arm they're in.
Now, with relapsing MS, that's how we used to do it, but it's changed now, right? So that most of the time with relapsing MS, you're going to be randomized to an FDA-approved treatment versus the experimental treatment, right?
Yep. And in these settings as well, the blinding, when possible, is still maintained, although sometimes it's not possible just based on, the way a drug is administered and, say common effects people may see with specific drugs.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. They call it the double dummy study, right? So you're either taking a placebo pill and maybe the real infusion, or a placebo infusion and the real pill.
Yes. And again, this is done to ensure that there is as little bias as possible in both patients reporting how they're doing and in study physicians examining how patients are doing, because obviously in phase 3 clinical trials, we're looking for clinical effects that can be influenced by perception.
So, Jiwon, what are the advantages of someone to participate in a clinical trial?
Well, there's a number of advantages. First of all, from an individual standpoint, it allows you access to agents that may have much better effects than what we currently have to treat people with MS. And from a larger perspective, it allows patients who wish to do so to contribute to developing science in the field, because MS, fortunately, is one of these fields where we've made a huge amount of progress in the last 10 to 20 years. And if not for clinical trials and all of these other scientific studies, we would not be where we are today. However, from a risk standpoint, again, we need to keep in mind that clinical trials are experimental settings, and so there is this big unknown factor of safety with some of these experimental agents. And so this is something that obviously patients need to keep in mind. And this is why the informed consent process is so essential in any clinical trial.
I think one nice thing about clinical trials is you do get that intensive care by the study team. So you are, being monitored very closely. You have routine MRI scans that are covered by the clinical trial, and so you're being monitored carefully. A lot of close attention, and I think some people that are not great about taking their medication regularly, we're counting pills and making sure that you're getting what you need.
Yeah, and I think that is a huge motivating factor for many people who have participated in clinical trials in the past.
So there's built-in safeguards in clinical trials. One of them is an IRB. What does that mean?
For any clinical trial to be approved, there is an institutional review board or an ethics board that really rigorously reviews the clinical trial protocol to ensure that every effort can be made to maintain patient safety, and confidentiality is a part of that as well. And then once the trial is launched, there has to be a data and safety monitoring board as part of the clinical trial. That's an independent group of people that constantly checks in and makes sure that the trial is being conducted as it should be. In certain settings, when there is some sort of unexpected side effect, there are processes written into the protocol to ensure that, if needed, patients can be removed or withdrawn from the study, appropriate medical attention is given, and if there is some sort of blinding process, those patients are unblinded, and also obviously the investigator, to ensure that the patient can receive the necessary medical attention that they need.
Yeah, what about like breakthrough MRI activity? So if you have a lot of activity on your MRI, can you find out about that?
In different clinical trial protocols, there are different stipulations made about the degree of MRI activity that one needs to observe before these results are revealed to the investigator and then the patient's treating neurologist. The International Clinical Trials Committee recently had a discussion about this issue, and there actually have been some commentaries published in recent years in some of our flagship MS journals about the need to continue to provide this information. So the argument to that is that obviously it takes away a little bit from the blinding of the clinical trial and all of the scientific rigor that we talked about before. So it's always a balance. So I think with that point, Barry, I think if there is an overwhelming aggressive amount of activity, it goes without saying that this is something that the patient as well as the treating neurologist should be alerted about. But when it comes to, say, a little bit of new MRI activity, I think the jury is still out. And I
Right.
clearly see the arguments for both. And so we'll have to see how the field evolves with respect to that issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. I think, definitely people should know that if you do have a relapse in a clinical trial or have a couple relapses, you always have the opportunity to exit the clinical trial. And so just because you joined in doesn't mean you have to be totally committed for 2 years. And some of our clinical trials, we have over 90% of patients staying all the way through the 2-year clinical trial, but sometimes we have up to 30% dropout. But if it's not going well for you or there's safety issues shows up, I'm sure your treating neurologist will want you to do that if it's not going well.
Exactly.
So bottom line, why would you recommend someone to participate in a clinical trial?
Some of the agents that are currently being tested in relapsing MS clinical trials are, from a scientific standpoint, really interesting because they target different pathways than many of the agents that we use now in clinical practice do. So there could be a lot of added clinical benefit for certain patients. And so I think that's one aspect, the added clinical benefit. As you treat people over the years, you start to understand people's personalities more. And I have a group of people that I'm taking care of who are always really keen to get involved in the latest and most interesting science. And so for people like that, I'll always talk about many of the emerging clinical trials just because I know that they're interested and potentially may want to participate. And then, a specific group of patients that I can think of that I often recommend clinical trials to are those with progressive MS. I will often recommend clinical trials because sometimes it's the only avenue that I can think of that potentially may benefit them from a clinical perspective. But obviously, there always is the risk associated with clinical trials in that, number one, the agent may not be effective and there may be safety concerns.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think we have a long way to go in progressive MS, and the only way we're going to get there is by trying new agents, not only in progressive MS, but also looking at remyelination compounds to try to restore some function in people living with MS or slow down progression.
Yes, the remyelinating agents and the other neuroprotective and reparative agents are really the future for people with progressive MS and maybe across the spectrum of MS in general.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. O. It's a pleasure having you on this MS Living Well podcast, and I appreciate all your insights and all you do for people living with MS in Canada and around the globe.
Thank you for having me, Barry. It's been a pleasure.
My next guest is Dr. Robert Bermel, who's a neurologist at the Mellon Center for Multiple Sclerosis at the Cleveland Clinic. He received his medical degree with a thesis honors from the State University New York, SUNY Buffalo, and then went on to do his neurology residency training and was chief resident at the Cleveland Clinic. Stayed on at Cleveland Clinic for clinical neuroimmunology and advanced imaging fellowship. Dr. Bermel not only takes care of people living with MS, but he's really committed to research, not only imaging research, but also clinical trials. And his current focus is really the identification of new ways of imaging the nervous system to improve our understanding recovery from demyelinating disease. So, Dr. Bermel, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Dr. Singer. I'm really happy to talk to you today about this topic.
So, how have clinical trials really changed MS care over the past couple of decades?
So, when you think about neurological disorders, you think of things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease. These are some of the most challenging disorders that exist. And of all of our big challenges, I think multiple sclerosis is far ahead of the others in terms of being a treatable disease. And it's largely because we figured out how to do clinical trials in MS. There have been so many clinical trials in MS over the last 25 years that finally we can call MS, at least most forms of MS, a highly treatable disease, even though there's still an enormous need out there for the cure. So if you compare us to other fields like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and ALS, I really think we're far ahead of the pack, and it's largely owed to clinical trials.
Some of our clinical trials are versus placebo, like we talked about with Dr. O, but some of our clinical trials are compared to another drug. And what does that tell us?
We're lucky now in MS to have multiple disease-modifying therapies for MS, but it's actually ushered in a new problem, which is sometimes we're unsure of which ones to use in which situations or which one would be better than another. Some trials are what are called head-to-head trials, where they actually compare one medication against another, or in some cases, maybe a combination of medications against an individual medicine. And that is really nice in that it gives us head-to-head data testing whether one is more effective than another. This can be a really powerful tool when you pair it with something that you guys talked about with Dr. O, which is randomization. And so if people are willing to participate in trials and willing to be randomized, it really gives us very high quality scientific evidence about which of those medications might be more powerful or might be better tolerated, have a better side effect profile in a given disease.
And for a given patient.
Yeah, totally. So I have to say, everything that we're talking about with clinical trials is really dependent on patients being willing to enroll in trials. People in the MS community have an amazing reputation of embracing clinical trials, and that is like so important. So we would not have had the advances in the last 25 years in the field of MS if we didn't have patients willing to enroll in clinical trials. The real reason to do it is because you're contributing to the research and helping people who come after you with this disease know more and have more options available to them than you had or the people before you did. That willingness to participate, it's just been an amazing advantage to us because it's led to these treatment advances that we have today.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think many of my patients who participated said the same thing. Maybe it's not for me, but maybe it's for the next generation of people living with MS. So, what about real world studies? So, we've heard about phase 1, 2, and 3, and you get out into the real world. How important are those clinical trials, what we call phase 4 clinical trials, once a drug gets FDA approved and on the market?
Yeah, so phase 4 trials, whether they're extension studies after the original clinical trials or if they're what we would call observational trials, often do not involve any randomization, and the patient always knows which medication they're on. And oftentimes that medication has been chosen and the patient is being followed right along in routine clinical care. And so if you can gather data from that environment, we can learn a lot about how these medications work in broader groups of patients. So patients who may not have met the original inclusion criteria for a trial, say they had a comorbidity, something like diabetes, we can gain experience in these observational studies or phase 4 trials with that broader patient population and really learn how the drug performs in clinical practice. And so having those phase 4 trials or the observational studies really colors that effectiveness conversation and gives us a lot of information about how the medications perform in the real world.
Excellent. Let's look at clinical trials. Are there specific clinical trials that are going to shed new insight into MS that you're excited about?
I think there's a couple of exciting things going on. One is a group of trials that are testing not just single treatments, but treatment strategies. So these are 2 trials sponsored by PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Initiative, that are testing the hypothesis that maybe people newly diagnosed with MS going on their first therapy should go on a highly effective therapy first line. So this is actually randomizing patients to either go on a highly effective therapy or to go on a standard efficacy therapy. You should think of the high efficacy therapies in general as sort of the monoclonal antibodies, the IV or injectable medicines of the antibodies. And you should think of the standard efficacy therapies as either our go-to platform injectable medicines or the oral medicines for MS. And each of these arms of the trial has sort of what we would call a safety valve in it, so that if a patient is not doing well on a medicine, they get taken off that and put on a different medicine. And patients are being followed, and they're being followed for either disability progression in the case of the TREAT MS trial, or followed for both clinical and for brain atrophy in the DELIVER MS trial. And we're going to measure these things and see which treatment strategy is associated with the best outcomes over 2 or 3 years. The other really cool thing that's going on is testing medications in progressive MS. And so there have been a couple of recent clinical trial successes in progressive MS, and I'm excited to see the number of options that we have expanding potentially for progressive MS. And hopefully we can talk about some of those specific trials that are going on as well.
Yeah, let's dive right into it. So let's talk about progressive MS. So some trials are specifically for primary progressive MS. Some trials are people that started out relapsing and then they converted to secondary progressive. And then we have some where patients are kind of lumped together. You have progressive MS, both SPMS and primary progressive MS. So there's trials going on in all 3 spaces, which is exciting. So let's talk about some of those agents. What about simvastatin? So in the UK, there's a phase 3 trial with 1,180 patients. So any excitement on that cholesterol medication?
Yeah, there's been historical excitement around this cholesterol medication, simvastatin, in progressive MS, and some really interesting early data showing the potential that it slows brain atrophy and improves disability outcomes. Another one is something called ibudilast, which is a molecule that has been used as a treatment for asthma in Japan. And that medication in a mixed group of primary and secondary progressive MS patients was shown to actually benefit brain volume loss or brain atrophy in a phase 2 study. and actually showed a couple of our visual outcome measures benefit on those, and one advanced MRI measure as well on gray matter volume loss or cortical thickness in mixed progressive MS, secondary and primary progressive. So really exciting stuff. There's a number of medications we can talk about in progressive MS for sure.
One is mestidatab, and we had some positive clinical trial results in 301 patients and showing a benefit on disability. And this affects some cells that may be involved in inflammation, including a cell called microglia, right, that we see that may be along the edges of lesions causing some inflammation, chronic inflammation in people with progressive MS. And even lipoproic acid, which is an anti-inflammatory antioxidant medication, right?
Yeah, for sure. All have early phase results which show potential in progressive MS. And I think this really outlines, in a world where we don't have highly effective treatments yet in progressive MS, it really underscores the need for people to enroll in clinical trials if they're at all interested.
Yeah, one very interesting category in the research of MS is BTK inhibitors. These BTK inhibitors target B cells. And we know that B cells play an important role in causing disease activity in MS. For example, some of our medications that are highly effective target just B cells. Can you talk a little bit more about BTK inhibitors, Rob?
Yeah, so BTK inhibitors or Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors are potentially a really exciting category that we're going to see a lot more information coming out over the next few years. And they're being tested in relapsing, remitting, and in progressive disease. What they do is they inhibit this enzyme called Bruton's tyrosine kinase, which is involved in B cell maturation. And so it does not get rid of all the B cells, but it sort of slows down the maturation of B cells. And there may be some evidence actually that it's expressed preferentially in what are called autoreactive B cells, or the B cells that are involved in causing disease. And so, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could affect more of the cells that are causing the disease rather than having to get rid of all the B cells, some of which we know are responsible for normal health and defense against diseases. And so this idea that we could inhibit the BTK enzyme is really an exciting development in MS. And there's data on at least a few of these different BTK inhibitors now that they're effective against our traditional outcome measures in MS, things like relapses or MRI lesions. But to be honest, it's more the different effects. It's the effect potentially on other cells in the immune system called macrophages or microglia that are also quite exciting. So there might be actually much more added benefit to these molecules beyond just B cell depletion, especially since many of these molecules get into the brain, actually into the central nervous system, which is really exciting because it might mean they have the potential to do good on components, especially of progressive MS, that exist in the central nervous system but not in the peripheral blood.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Rob. I mean, if you look at the cells that it goes after, not just the B cells, but it targets the microglia, which may play a significant role in progressive MS. And tolebrutinib, one of the BTK inhibitors, is being studied both in secondary progressive and in primary progressive MS in two separate trials. I think, you mentioned the relapse rate reduction with these medications. It's also very, impressive in terms of relapses in MRI. Evobrutinib, which is given 75 milligrams twice a day, had a significant impact on active lesions on the brain with contrast. Between weeks 12 and 24, it dropped it by about 70%. And the relapses went from maybe one relapse every 3 years down to about one relapse less than every 10 years once you put someone on the medication. Side effects from that one included some nasal infections, nasopharyngitis infections, and some elevated liver blood tests. And then tolebrutinib, 60 milligrams, it was also studied in a phase 2 clinical trial, and it prevented 85% of those active lesions on the brain and 89% reduction on those T2 lesions. Side effects were headache and upper respiratory infection. So some really impressive data in relapsing MS, and hopefully it'll translate into our patients with progressive MS who really need more options.
Yeah, I share the excitement for this. We are trying to get the word out to patients that these exciting trials are available and that they should really ask their physicians about it, because we need to get patients into the trials in order to get the trials done and get the answer so that patients can get the benefit of this therapy.
Yeah, and there's a trial going on too, evobrutinib in relapsing MS and fenebrutinib in primary progressive MS. So this class is really kind of exploding. Let's move on to myelin repair. There's been a lot of interest in this over the years. I know I've been very interested. I've done about 5 different clinical trials at our center on myelin repair. Where are we, and where do you think this is headed?
So what we need for remyelination is a clear readout.
So what do you mean by readout? Why don't you explain what that really means?
Yeah, so that means what can we measure in phase 2 trials in a small number of people that will give us a signal that the medication's working. And in our traditional relapsing remitting trials, it's something like gadolinium enhancing lesions on an MRI or active lesions on an MRI. If a medication benefits that measure in phase 2 trials, it will translate into a clinical benefit in phase 3 trials, meaning that patients will have fewer relapses and they'll have less disability in phase 3 trials. So that gives us an opportunity to select medications that are worth exposing thousands of patients to in phase 3, because we don't want to take a medication forward if it's not going to work. So we want to have a method of selecting ones that are highly likely to work.
We've done some monoclonal antibodies. I've been involved in using 3 different monoclonal antibodies for myelin repair, and unfortunately we haven't hit on any of those. There are some exciting trials coming forward, one with nanocrystals of gold, seeing if you can repair optic nerve, and then another one where you're actually trying to stimulate optic nerve repair after optic neuritis. Hormones is another approach. So there was also another study called Totem MS and giving IM testosterone. And at University of California, San Francisco, they've been looking at a selective estrogen receptor modulator, bezodoxepin, and clemenstein, which is an antihistamine. And these compounds have been shown to stimulate myelin growth, like an experiment where you have little cones with little cells that make myelin, and you put on different old medications and see which ones grow. So we may be able to repurpose some old medications for remyelination.
Yeah, this kind of rapid screening process has become potentially something that's really useful.
What about managing symptoms? Anything you're excited about?
Yeah, ideally we'll have some promising things coming down the line, especially in terms of fatigue management in MS, which I know is such a common problem affecting so many people.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting areas in research is looking at cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue and MS. There's been some positive trials recently. Interestingly, one that's going on right now, University of Washington Combo MS, looks at cognitive behavioral therapy, modafinil, or both for MS fatigue in 330 patients. So we do need, I think, some more big trials. Some nabiximols are being looked at in terms of spasticity in people with MS, tibial nerve stimulators for bladder function, estriadiol for cognition. So there's a lot of interest in trying to improve the quality of life for all our patients. And so why would you recommend someone participate in a clinical trial rather than starting an FDA-approved treatment?
I would say every patient that I see is potentially a candidate for a trial, and we offer research to them as an opportunity. And then it's just a question of what's their specific situation and where could they potentially fit. Now, most patients end up going on FDA-approved therapy and perhaps enrolling in observational research, but for patients in particular situations, either relapsing or remitting MS, who have particular situations looking for other options, or for patients with progressive MS in particular, we talk very seriously about randomized clinical trials. And I think there's some definite benefits to them. Number one, patients, even if they're on placebo in a clinical trial, do better than someone who is outside of a clinical trial and not on a medicine. So there are benefits to being in a clinical trial that include things like kind of the attention and the care that the clinical research team pays to a patient and the type of almost like concierge type care that comes in a clinical trial. Of course, care within a clinical trial is covered as a part of the budget of the trial, so there's no expense to the patient, which is for some people another added benefit. It's often a very regimented structure where the visits are scheduled. For some patients, they really like that workflow. But finally, I would just say the number one reason to be in a trial is to give back. And I have patients who say, well, I know it's not likely that my kids would get this disease, but for them and their friends and that generation, I want to give back and I want to help to develop the therapies of the future. And that's a really gratifying thing for people to be a part of.
That's really superb. So for you, what's the most rewarding aspect of clinical research?
Yeah, those of us who went into neurology, we sit with individual patients in the room and we try to do our best with each individual patient one-on-one. Like I try to get that individual patient the absolute best that we can get them that day. But even our best is not good enough oftentimes. And so if you're in neurology and in MS in particular, I don't think you're really contributing as much as we all could if you don't think of the bigger picture and think of advancing the field, right? And finding treatments and cures for these horrible challenges that we have in neurology really depends largely on clinical trials. And so that hope, I guess, is the best way to put it, that the work that we do today in clinical trials is going to make the world better for our kids' generation, our grandkids' generation, is really the most rewarding part. And it's why many of us went into neurology. So we're so grateful for the patients that volunteer their time and enroll in clinical trials and participate in research. And it's really an honor to help them along the way and take care of them.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the next generation, but I can think of a lot of my patients who have participated in clinical trials have really changed their disease course around for them. And so I can think of many people that were really struggling who entered a clinical trial. One of them that I can think of entered a clinical trial and came off of Social Security disability, went back to work and still working a decade later. And other patients that were having relapses after relapses entered a clinical trial, got randomized to a treatment, and they're still on the treatment. Now it's FDA approved, and they've been on the treatment for a decade. So sometimes going into a clinical trial and getting randomized to a new treatment sometimes could be the right move for you. So it may not even be for the next generation, maybe for yourself. And so I think it's definitely something that if you're out there living with MS and you do go to a center where there's clinical trials available, it is important to have that conversation. Another great place to go is clinicaltrials.gov. So if you go on there, you just put in MS and your location, and you can find out all the clinical trials that are going on. It's kind of interesting. Right now on clinicaltrials.gov, there are 400 clinical trials in the world that are recruiting for people living with MS. So there are a lot of clinical trials out there. So if you're listening to this, we'd love to have you participate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singer, for doing this and for getting the word